Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started so we can get this going on time. Welcome to today's webinar, and we know your time is valuable, and we appreciate you joining us. Our session will begin shortly, but let's cover a few housekeeping items before we dive into introducing the RCV in a Box project webinar. Due to the number of attendees, we've muted participants to reduce audio interference. If you have technical issues, please use the chat feature located at the bottom of your control panel to send us a message, and we will try to assist you. If you have any questions, submit them using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And we've set aside some time for Q&A at the end of the session, but we'll answer any questions that we're unable to address during the live session through follow-up correspondence. And a recording of this event and associated materials will be placed on the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center website as soon as possible. So for those that are not familiar with the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center, we provide a compilation of best practices and firsthand experiences from jurisdictions that have used this method of voting with a focus on election administration. And our website, rcvresources.org, and other content have been developed as educational tools for election administrators, policymakers, voters, candidates, and others. So today's presenters are yours truly, Tiffany Montemayor, Chris Hughes, and Ryan Kirby. I'm Tiffany, and I'm the Senior Director of Programming and Outreach. I became an elections administrator in 2020 as the Public Relations Manager for the State of Alaska Division of Elections, and I helped implement RCV in Alaska's 2022 general elections. Now, as the Senior Director of Programming and Outreach for the RCV Resource Center, I'm responsible for overseeing the development and publication of programming content. Chris Hughes is the Senior Director of Policy and General Counsel for the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center. He's contributed to RCV legislation and regulation in more than 20 states, including laws passed in Maine, Utah, and Virginia, and assisted with ranked choice voting implementations in dozens of jurisdictions, from Newton, Utah, with a population of 794, all the way up to New York City. Chris also co-produces the RCV RC's podcast, RCV Clips. Chris is admitted to practice law in the state of New York. Ryan Kirby is the Director of Policy for the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center. He supports the Senior Director of Policy and General Counsel and administers the organization's internship program. Ryan previously served as the Chief of Staff for State Senator Cheryl Kagan in the Maryland Senate, where, among a multitude of issues, he supported the senator's election legislation. So let's get started.
Thanks, Tiffany, and thanks everyone for joining us today for the launch of this project. I am going to talk for just a few minutes about why we're launching this project and a bit about what the project is, but I'll leave Ryan to do most of the heavy lifting on all of that. So, like Tiffany was just saying, we at the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center aim to provide resources for election administrators who are running ranked choice voting elections. Our goal is to make it as easy as possible for folks who are running ranked choice voting elections to do it well and to do it transparently and to maintain trust with their voters. And what we've learned over the course of our time working on, ranked choice voting implementations is that there's a few areas of election administration where there tend to be changes that ranked choice voting causes. These are places where when you're implementing ranked choice voting, you can almost guarantee that you'll have to do some work here to make sure that you're ready to run ranked choice voting effectively. And those are the things listed on this slide. That's voter education, ranked choice voting ballot design, prepping your voting equipment. So making sure your voting equipment, the stuff you use to run your elections, both can actually design ranked choice voting ballots and capture ranked choice voting data and produce ranked choice voting results. And running pre-election testing of that equipment, making sure that your equipment will accurately capture all that data, will accurately scan in those ballots that voters are casting. Results reporting, So making sure that when you're showing people how ranked choice voting elections got counted, who won, why they won, and doing it in a transparent and trustworthy way is really, really important. And then finally, post-election audits and recounts. So whenever you're looking at your results, making sure that you have accurately counted up your ballots by conducting audits, reviewing your processes and procedures, and if there's a really close election, if someone files a request, conducting recounts successfully. These are really relevant or important because they can be really high pressure situations when you're running a ranked choice voting election. So those are the big domains we tend to see impacted by ranked choice voting. And so we as an organization have produced a ton of reports touching on all these different things. But we've also found over time that as we've dug more into all these different subject areas, ballot design, results reporting, audits, recounts, voting equipment, what have you, we've produced more and more material, but we have also we've also realized that as we create more content, it can be hard to find all of that content. So that's why we've made the RCV in a Box project. And I'll let Ryan talk a bit more about that in just a second. I have a couple quick slides here too. One thing I think that's really important when you're actually implementing a ranked choice voting election is thinking about your timeline, making sure that you are planning out your whole election effectively. And so we've made this timeline that is part of this project to help folks plan out if and when you're running a ranked choice voting election, when you might need to start thinking about how ranked choice voting will impact your voter education plan or your voting equipment, making sure you're getting everything lined up. And then finally, I'll just mention that the RCV in a Box project is also responding to a lot of questions we tend to get from election administrators. We hear from folks across the country asking, how ranked choice voting impacts XYZ aspect of their election administration. And so what we're trying to do with the RCV election in a Box project is make it as easy as possible for folks to find answers to these frequently asked questions. So that's what I'm really hoping everyone who's attending today and who may be watching this in the future can get out of the RCV election in a Box project. We want you to be able to use this resource to, if and when you're running a ranked choice voting election, can really quickly get up to speed and get all of your materials, all your processes, all your procedures ready to go for ranked choice voting pretty quickly. So with that, I'll pass it over to Ryan to talk a bit more about the project.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. So with this project, it really spawned from a lot of, like Chris was saying, the frequently asked questions that we were getting. And in many cases, Chris and I were sending a lot of the same documents, or we were creating kind of similar things for different jurisdictions and then tweaking them a little bit based on or what was going on in that place. And so we were kind of thinking, okay, what are the things we can do to try and make it as easy as possible for election administrators? And so we were looking at creating what we now call the RCV in a Box. And it is our goal to make it a one-stop shop to help election administrators get implementation best practices, reports, and real-world examples all in one place. And so we designed these resources to try and provide all the tools necessary to begin implementation, but also provide election officials with flexibility that they'll need to make the ranked choice voting election work for them in their jurisdiction. Because as we know, every place is a little bit different. And so a lot of these resources are designed from a national perspective, but able to be tweaked to fit within what that jurisdiction needs. One of the things I'll say is that this is a spreadsheet. We're using Google Sheets, so it's nothing too complicated and something that we're all probably pretty familiar with. And so it should be pretty easy to navigate. And one of the other things based on some of the frequently asked questions we get is that issues tend to be based on themes. So we try to break up the RCV in a Box that you'll see in a second, but based on its themes, so you can kind of more easily find things. So Chris, if you can move to the next slide. Now we're going to do the demo portion of the webinar. So I will start to share my screen so that you can see what it looks like. All right. So as you can see, this is our website, and we have this brand new section for the RCV in a box, which you can find in the Tools tab. And so this is what it'll look like when you go to look at it. And there's a lot of helpful information here, but we'll go ahead and dive into the RCV in a box project. I already got it uploaded because sometimes Google Sheets can take a little bit to load. So you can see that here, it's a Google Sheet. It's nothing too complicated. We're all used to seeing this. And at the beginning, we've got some introductory text, just some instructions on how to read it. But we'll first dive into our first section, which is organizations offering RCV implementation support. These are some of our partner organizations. We're going to put them towards the top in case you had other questions or specific things that we wanted to dive into. They're great resources, and they are focused specifically on implementation. These aren't advocates. And so they are here to help election administrators do their jobs and make elections as good as we can get them, and make the lives of election administrators as easy as possible. So diving into some of the tools, first up, we have voter education tools. Definitely one of the most frequently asked about things that we hear about. And one of the things I want to highlight in here is that you'll notice everything has a hyperlink, either to the external source or it's saved within our website and our drive. But you can see who wrote it, so who the author is, and then a brief explainer about a sentence, maybe two. It's super brief, so take it with it, it's definitely condensed. But one of the things I want to highlight here is this is an example from Arlington, Virginia. This is a tool that a jurisdiction can take and make it of their own. But this is a toolkit that they created to help with voter education, and they shared it with us. They sent it to us because they thought it might be helpful to include. And so it has everything that an election administrator or a local group would need to run a local tabulation of a single winner RCV contest. And so it's got everything down to the ballots already printed, super easy to use. And there's lots of other resources like this in our voter education section. One of the other sections is the voter education websites. So if you want to see, if you're an election administrator and you're either working with your IT department, or if you yourself are responsible for managing your website, we have a couple of different examples that you can look at. One of the ones I will highlight here is Alaska, because we have Tiffany from our staff here, so I wanted to give Alaska a little bit of a shout out. And so they have a section on their election information website, so about ranked choice voting. They have a helpful video here, explainer, and then they have their FAQ section here with a drop-down menu with a lot of helpful information, and then some explainers here as well. And a lot of great information here, and there are other jurisdictions just like it. So there's a couple different ways that all these different jurisdictions talk about RCV. They have different uses for RCV. And in this section, we also wanted to highlight the jurisdiction name with the link, the type of RCV that they use. So if you have want to look for one that's most similar to what your jurisdiction is using, and then a brief note about what kind of voter education website it is. Next, when it comes to designing RCV ballots, we have a lot of different materials here, but I want to show the sample RCV ballots folder. This is something that we've already had up on our website, but wanted to make sure it was available to election administrators who are curious about designing an RCV ballot. We have a lot of different vendors on here, lots of different subfolders of best practices, and then some additional sample ballots as well. But you can see, we've already talked about Arlington, an example here of what their sample ballot looked like. You can see the single winner contest here, as well as the ranked choice voting contest. And there's a whole bunch of different options you can choose from and play around with. Looking at our next section, we have the counting RCV ballots. And here, I want to highlight one of our brand new resources that we just released. It's our voter intent encyclopedia. So this is a new section on our website, as you can see, just released yesterday. And here we have the goal here with this project was to try and highlight all the different ways that voters can mark a ballot. We know that every election administrators have to deal with some of the odd things that voters choose to mark on their ballots. And as a result, ranked choice voting is also has a part in that. And so election administrators have to deal with some of that and adjudicating and figuring out what a voter meant. And so we created this guide to try and cover all of the different rules that jurisdictions use across the country, and how they handle ballots and how those different marks can be interpreted. So here beginning, we have a correctly marked ballot, and then we try to provide a quick search guide. So if you're looking for a specific kind of rule that might match what you're looking for, you can quickly find it. So if you're looking for overvote rules, you can quickly jump to the overvote section. And then we talk about the different rules, what some of those rules are a little bit more in depth, and then an example. So if you want to look to New York City for their overvote rule, you can quickly find an example of that and then look for what the statute looks like and how they wrote it. But then also how that can be interpreted. So we have an example ballot, and then we also have right here how that ballot would be interpreted. So with an overvote, they would all go inactive there. So that's an example of another resource that's available for jurisdictions. But when it comes to counting ballots, there's definitely a lot of different ways and a lot of different information out there. So we tried to provide that all in one place. And then when you're talking about counting ballots, that's typically done through voting equipment. So we wanted to provide some information about voting equipment, all the different tools that election officials have. So we have a lot of different information here. One of the things I want to highlight is RCTab. RCTab is our free open source software. You can download it from our website here, but it is designed to tabulate RCV elections. And I also want to call out Matthew and Malachi on our team. They manage the RCTab project with an awesome group of volunteers, and they help make all of this possible. But this is a resource that's available to election officials and advocates, anybody who wants to download it. You can learn more about it with our fact sheets, and you could even go to GitHub and download the tool directly from there and play around with some of the sample folders that are in here with cast vote records. But that's just one of the many tools that exist with voting equipment. There's information about different voting systems here. What are their RCV case capabilities? And then one of the things I also want to highlight is that we try to include not just RCV best practices. There are some in here that are just generally applicable. RCV may not change anything inherently, but it's just generally really helpful to know that about your elections, and always helpful to include some of that. So you'll notice if you click on something, it's not necessarily RCV specific. We chose to include it because it has particularly relevance to election officials and some of the work they're doing. If you're already looking at some of these practices, is there anything that can be updated while you're already looking at it? Next section we have is results reporting. And then I want to highlight the how to produce RCV results report. This is a white paper that we wrote and shows all the steps needed to create RCV results. It provides some helpful information about creating results generally, but it also highlights some of the areas that are most likely to be new for jurisdictions adopting RCV. So lots of helpful information here, sources, and there are lots of examples and best practices as well. In our next section, we have some of these examples. So if you want to see how jurisdictions are reporting their actual results, what is the average voter going to see? There are a lot of different jurisdictions here, and similar to our previous voter education website examples with the jurisdiction, the contests that they're showing the results for, and then some notes. One of the ones here I want to highlight is San Francisco. So once we go to their website, we can see they have all of their elections in one place. And we'll go back to one of their more recent RCV contests. And so you can see, once we get to the ranked choice voting section, they follow some of our best practices that we recommend when it comes to releasing results, of releasing as being, whenever you're counting ballots, releasing preliminary results, unofficial results, and doing the tabulation with it. So you can see in the beginning, they have their preliminary report. This was on election night. And we'll look at the DA short report real quick for district attorney race. And you can see, once the document opens, they did a tabulation on election night, and this is how it looked. And as you get further along throughout the counting process, they had different preliminary reports. They have a schedule that they follow as they get ballots. And they do the same thing, releasing all the tabulations as they count the ballots. And they did this all the way up through their final update and the election certification. So just want to give that a highlight if that's something you're looking at. But if not, there are other examples as well within the results reporting example section. As we approach the end of an election, one of the other things election administrators are considering are audits and recounts. So we have some helpful resources here to help address some of that. The one I'll highlight is the recounts of RCV reports, because that one's going to get an update pretty soon. But in this report, we tried to categorize some of the history of ranked choice voting recounts and provide some of the lessons learned there as well and best practices. You can see all of our resources that are linked in here, as well as the report itself, and all the different recounts that have happened with RCV. We're currently working on updates to the Alaska RCV recounts that happened in 2022. And we'll have that updated hopefully by the end of the summer or later in the year. And then there are also some good resources here for audits. That's definitely an ongoing conversation and comes up pretty frequently when talking with election administrators. So you can definitely check out some of the reports, or you can see how other jurisdictions either have presented about their audits or their processes. And then last but not least is our webinars and miscellaneous section. This is kind of our catch-all, where there wasn't something that cleanly fit into a specific place, or it just touched on so many different places that we couldn't put it in just one. So one of the ones I want to highlight here is our RCV Maps project. This is definitely one of our biggest and our signature resources. We look at all 50 states plus DC, and we review their voting equipment and their RCV capability. RCV Maps has also influenced a number of our other reports that you might have seen earlier, such as the How to Produce RCV Results project. But super helpful. If you haven't seen it yet, I would definitely take a look at your state. That's very helpful information about the voting equipment, and always something good to learn there. And then, one last thing I want to highlight was that if you were curious about the timeline that we showed earlier on the slides, you can definitely take a look at it much more in detail here. That was another one of the things in this resource that I wanted to show. But I think that's it for the actual Google Sheet itself. So I will turn it back over to Chris to open up the slides. Awesome. And so when we're looking at the future updates and suggestions, one of the benefits of using a Google Sheet is that whenever we edit something, you can see it automatically. You don't have to worry about re-downloading anything. Anytime we add a new resource, or something is updated with a text or anything like that, you get it instantaneously next time you go to look into RCV in a box. One of the other things is that at the top, we always include a timestamp for when it was last updated. So right now it's July 2024. But also another benefit with Google Sheet is that you can see the history of something. And so you can see when it was last updated, even if we forget. But that's always there. And then the last thing I'll say is that we're always looking for updates and new resources. RCV in a Box to us is going to be a living, breathing project. We're always going to be looking for things to improve, new best practices, those kinds of things. So if you're an election administrator or an advocate and you have something that you want to highlight from your jurisdiction, we are always accepting new resources. It might not end up in RCV in a Box specifically, but it will definitely have a home in the Resource Center library for sure. And so if you have a new idea or anything, or if you're missing anything and there's something you want to be included, definitely feel free to reach out to us. Our contact information is at the bottom of the slides, but also all over our website. So yeah, definitely feel free to reach out to us if you have a new resource you want to include, or there's something missing that you wish we would have more about. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to questions.
All right. Well, we have one question here, and it is, are there any federally certified software for tabulating RCV results?
Yes. So I'll talk a little bit about how testing and certification works for voting systems, and then explain where RCV fits into all of that. So at a high level, there are essentially two sets of like testing, approval, and certification regimes for voting equipment in the US. Stuff that is actually used to count ballots at polling places and to produce results in an elections office. There are state level approval and certification requirements, and there are federal approval and certification requirements, or standards, I should say. To be used in any state's elections, you need to get state certification. Um, but and there are some very basic requirements in federal law that are like every voting system, every piece of voting equipment used in the US needs to meet. But for all intents and purposes, states are the thing that control what can be used in any given state's elections. That being said, there is a thing called the Voluntary Voting System Guidelines, or VVSG, that are created by the Election Assistance Commission, the federal election administration agency, that some states say, in order to be used in our elections, in order for us to approve your use in our elections as a state, you need to get EAC certification. You need the EAC to say your voting equipment, you voting system vendor, your voting equipment meets those voluntary voting system guidelines. So all of that, I know that's sort of a long preamble, but that's like a high level description of how the voting system certification process works in the US. And then the other thing to note is actually getting EAC certification is only full end-to-end voting systems can get EAC certification. So you have to sort of do the whole elections process in a single, not a single piece of equipment, but in a one submission to the EAC. You have to have, your polling place scanners, your central scanners, your election management software, and any other tools that might come together to run an election submitted as a whole set of materials to get EAC certification. That's just how that's designed. And so to answer your specific question, there is one vendor, Unison, that has gotten EAC certification for a full end-to-end ranked choice voting solution as part of like their broader voting system approval. So they're approved not just for ranked choice voting, but for a number of other voting methods, vote for one, a plurality election like we're familiar with, and others. And then there's other vendors, Hart and ES&S in particular, have gotten EAC certification for designing ranked choice voting ballots and generating what's known as cast vote record data, the stuff that's used to process the round by round count in a ranked choice voting election. But they don't include in that EAC certification any tabulation capability. So the thing that RC Tab does that Ryan mentioned, that processing the round by round count, that's not included in those certifications. And then finally, Clear Ballot, who is a relatively newer vendor, has applied for EAC certification. They are going through the process right now to get a full end-to-end ranked choice voting solution certified. And that application actually includes RC Tab as part of that whole voting system. So sort of a long answer, but I hope it all made sense.
So there's another question here. Do you have speakers who can participate in webinars for local organizations? And if so, how can I contact you to request a speaker?
Yeah, I mean, we are happy to present to local organizations. Tiffany, I might throw this back at you, given that's a thing you've been doing a lot recently. Tiffany, you may need to unmute. Sorry.
Yes, I did. I did need to unmute. So the answer is yes, like Chris was saying. And there's a few of us here on staff who do those presentations, and we can certainly do anything like that and pretty flexible with the scheduling. So if you just contact us via email, then we can start setting that up, and and we'll go over kind of what it is you were wanting the presentation to be about. What kind of focus were you wanting? Because it could be something like just a general what is ranked choice voting and the explanation of it, or it could be more implementation focused. So if you just send us an email, we're happy to set that up with you. So here's another question. I live in Michigan, where a few cities have passed RCV legislation, but nothing can be done until the state comes up with enabling legislation. I think voters need to see RCV used in daily activities, such as choosing titles for a book club. Is there any free website that would allow regular folk to experiment with RCV?
That's a great question. And that's actually one that we have included in one of our voter education tools in the RCV in a box section. So you should be able to find in there a rankedvote.co link. So you can create mock elections to use that for voter education aspects if you're an election administrator, but from the advocacy side, if you're looking to incorporate in kind of like daily life scenarios, like you're talking about with like a book club, you can absolutely use that. If you've ever voted in some of our RCV polls that the Resource Center has put up on social media, that's what we use, ranked vote. Our most recent one, I believe, was an ice cream flavor or done favorite songs, those kinds of things. So you can definitely use that tool to incorporate RCV into like some of the daily polls or decision-making things that you've used. And there are other ones out there as well, but that's the one that we wanted to highlight when working with ranked vote.
I've got a question here. How did you pick the resources to use and include in this?
That's a great question as well. I think when it comes down to it, like a lot of the frequently asked questions we get from both advocates and election administrators, we tend to be sharing a lot of like the same resources or answering kind of the same questions. So I know Chris and I did some brainstorming back, I guess it was beginning of the year, and we were kind of going through the list of all the different topics that we were getting asked about, and then breaking it down from there. And then looking at some of the other resources we have that already exist and trying to decide which ones to highlight. Some of the things we were looking for were like examples. When I was trying to put those pieces together, were which are the ones that actually follow some of the best practices that we recommend. And so trying to highlight those, but then also trying to get a diversity when it comes to jurisdiction, location, and size, the types of RCV contests that are on the ballot. So there are definitely a number of different factors that went into it, but then also trying to provide a little bit of diversity when it comes to like the number of authors and organizations that provide support. I want to make sure we highlight some of the great work that's being done by like Center for Civic Design and as well as some of the jurisdictions that are producing a lot of great material. I don't know if there's anything you want to add, Chris.
Yeah, I just want to reinforce, like we were trying to both identify the best stuff out there and give a good set of options, because we know jurisdictions, people running elections face a lot of different like constraints and pressures. So one state or one city's elections may just need to use different tools or take a different approach than somewhere else. So we tried to have a good variety of types of jurisdictions using ranked choice voting. So if you're a more rural jurisdiction, you have more rural places to look at and see, well, how did things work here? You know, we have fewer resources, we're more spread out. How can we make this work for us, as opposed to a more urban jurisdiction, which will be more concentrated and will have different sorts of considerations at play in how they're running all these different aspects of the election. So that's what we're trying to give people, a few different angles on the same problem.
So kind of in line with that, do you have any specific updates planned?
Well, when it comes to some of our reports, I know Chris and I are working on updating a number of those that we originally released in 2022. Since then, there have been a number of RCV elections, so those are ones that are definitely going to be are already in progress of being updated. And we try to do a somewhat routine review of our materials, and it's definitely something we're always looking to improve on. But the other thing is, you know, as we get closer to election day, we're always trying to grab as much of the voter education material and sample ballots and some of like the results reporting examples as we can as we get closer to 2024, there's November election, as well as all the ones that have been going on throughout the primary season and local elections. So we're always gathering some of that new material. I'll give a shout out to some of our interns who help us a lot with that collection. And definitely something that's ongoing. And if there are jurisdictions out there that, like I said earlier, have materials that maybe aren't on their website, because that's where we get a lot of our information, but they think it might be helpful behind the scenes for other election administrators, we're always happy to accept some of that and make it available to other election administrators.
Thanks, Ryan. We've got another question here. So, have you worked with jurisdictions that had problems with RCV election ballot miscounts? And how can you help after the fact when miscounts occur?
So we have seen so far there are 2 examples where jurisdictions provided or produced results that wound up including incorrect information or had used like the wrong set of rules in tabulating ranked choice voting results. We did not work directly on either of those implementations, so we weren't able to help with that. But I mean, there's a lot of things you can do to try and avoid those sorts of outcomes. I think first, you need to develop really thorough pre-election testing and make sure as a jurisdiction you are really familiar with both the ranked choice voting rules that are used in your jurisdiction, which is why we have a report called ranked choice voting tabulation options. It goes really into detail on the types of rules you can use to run a ranked choice voting election and tries to be really clear to help election administrators know exactly what rule has been adopted locally for them so they can design local procedures and policies to handle those correctly. And then, including pre-election testing. And also making sure we suggest, that jurisdictions conduct a lot of pre-election testing, not just of the actual ranked choice voting rules, but also of the sort of step-by-step process of how you'll produce election results and how you'll double check those results before you hit publish on them. Because we've seen in some jurisdictions that, and this has not just happened in ranked choice voting jurisdictions, but we've seen places, that have left test data in their equipment or have not zeroed out their election results in other ways, and making sure you've followed all of those, both like step-by-step processes and following some of the like baseline best practices for producing results and preparing for an election is super important. And then after, if you have made a mistake, if there's been an error, what we have seen in jurisdictions where this has happened, I think the first thing is being really clear that like this was a mistake and noting how you're going to resolve it, how you're going to improve processes going forward, and what generally and specifically what you're doing like right now in the next 24 hours or so to clear up any confusion that people have. That can take a lot of different forms, but in my experience, that tends to just be like being really clear with media and with other stakeholders about what went wrong and how to improve it, and what exactly you've done to make sure that the error won't show up in future runs of your results for that election and going into the future.
And I'll just add to what Chris was saying there at the end of that with transparency. Transparency is really important throughout the whole entire implementation process, but especially at the end, if there are any kind of miscounts or something that's kind of just off with the results. Transparency is just a key thing that administrators need to keep in mind and need to practice. Do we have any other questions? I am not really seeing anything. Ryan and Chris, is there anything else you want to add?
Oh, I'll just add a general thank you to when we were sending out the RCV inbox, the first draft of it, to a number of election administrators across the country that volunteered or a decent amount of information. Just like, hey, I thought this would be cool to include, or I thought other election administrators would appreciate this. Just a general shout out to them and all the hard work they do. And so, yeah, just definitely want to appreciate the work they're doing and looking forward to continuing this project.
second that. And I'll just say, I do hope everybody who was on today, take some time just to look through RCV in a Box. It's available on our website now. And we just want people to, take a look and see what works for them. It's built to help you start. It has some really basic introductory materials and also to help you ramp up and get really, really into the weeds and start answering some of the thornier questions that come up when you're implementing RCV. So we hope that it can, like Ryan said, be that one-stop shop to get you ready to run a ranked choice voting election successfully. And if you do have any questions, if there's any gaps, please, again, don't hesitate to reach out. Send us suggestions. We're always trying to make it better. And our goal is to continue to make this, the best place you can come to get that ranked choice voting material that you need.
Thanks, y'all. And thank you everyone for joining us for our RCV in a Box webinar. We appreciate your attendance and your great questions. We are going to post the recording and the Q&A document on the RCVRC's website and YouTube channel soon. The Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center depends on the generosity of our donors to present our webinars and provide other resources like the RCV in a Box. And so if you would like to make a donation to support our work, then head on over to our website at www.rcvresources.org/donate. Sponsorship opportunities are also available for our webinar series. And if you're interested in becoming a sponsor, please contact our Director of Development and Communications, Kelly Sechrist, at kelly.sechrist@rcvresources.org. Thank you again for your support. Goodbye.